Welcome to Family Revenge Betrayal. Stay tuned, have a fun time, and let's talk in the comments. Let's go.
My parents clapped in court while my father told the judge my yoga studio and truck finally belonged to my brother Cole. Everyone stared at me like I'd lost, and then Judge Sandoval stopped mid-page and asked, "Maya, are you lying too? Or are they?" Because of what followed. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I'm going to start where it hurt the most, because context can wait when your own parents try to erase you in public. I was sitting in that courtroom in Santa Clarita, California, watching my father point at my life like it was a prize on a shelf and announce to a judge that my yoga studio and my truck finally belonged to Cole. Like I was a temporary employee who'd overstayed her shift, and he was doing the company a favor by reassigning assets. And my mother actually gave 2 polite little claps like we were at a school assembly and not a legal proceeding about who gets to own what I built with my hands. I remember the sound of those claps more than I remember my grandfather's funeral hymns, because grief is one thing, but betrayal dressed up as family concern is a whole different kind of poison, and the room did what rooms always do when a confident man speaks first. It leaned toward him. It believed him. It prepared to blame the quiet woman for making it complicated. And I could feel the gallery scanning me like they were looking for proof that I was unstable, angry, irrational, something they could box up and label so they wouldn't have to face the real story. My father was in a navy suit with a tie that was just a little too loud, the kind of tie men wear when they want you to notice they're serious. And Cole sat between our parents with that relaxed posture that says, "I've already won." Like the verdict was a formality, and the judge was just there to stamp paperwork. My hands were clenched under the defense table, not shaking, not dramatic, just locked, because I learned early that if you show emotion in front of people like my parents, they don't see pain. They see leverage, and they will use it like a crowbar. Judge Sandoval was flipping through the file, quiet, controlled, the way judges get when they've heard every family swear they're doing what's best. And I watched my father's face as he delivered the performance he's been rehearsing my whole life. The caring dad who's burdened by his daughter's fragility, the worried parent who's only trying to protect her, while still making sure I lose the thing that proves I was never fragile in the first place. And when my mother smiled and clapped, I didn't just feel insulted, I felt something colder, the realization that this wasn't a fight between siblings, it was a coordinated campaign, a 3-person alliance that had decided my role years ago. Cole is the future, Maya is the helper, and if Maya becomes the future by herself, then something must be wrong with Maya, because it can't be wrong with the story they've been telling for decades. The plaintiff's attorney stood up first and talked like he was reading a bedtime story. Smooth voice, gentle words, and every sentence had the same hidden knife inside it, that I was overwhelmed, that I was isolated, that I had admitted exhaustion, and that Cole was stepping in out of love. And I almost laughed, because if you've ever worked 2 jobs and still stayed up sanding baseboards and scrubbing mirrors until your hands smell like vinegar and sweat, you know what exhaustion is. It's not instability. It's proof you're carrying weight other people refuse to lift. But the attorney didn't call it hard work. He called it impairment. He turned my discipline into a diagnosis, because that's what people do when they can't attack your results. They attack your mind. Then Cole took the stand and put on his soft voice, the one that makes strangers think he's a good boy, and he said, "Maya has always been sensitive," and he said it like sensitive means breakable, like sensitive means incapable, like sensitive means the business should be taken from me for my own good, and I watched him lie with my family's approval sitting right behind him like a backup choir. And this is the part that will make your blood pressure spike, so breathe with me, because I need you thinking clearly. My father testified next and didn't even pretend this was about a verbal agreement. He went straight to the heart of it, the hierarchy. He told the judge that Cole has what it takes to lead, that Cole has a real future, that Cole has a family, and that the studio and the truck belong with him. And I realized he wasn't arguing about property. He was arguing about worth. Like my value expires if I'm not someone's wife. Like my work doesn't count unless it's stamped by a man in the family, my mother followed. With that quiet tone women use when they want cruelty to sound like concern, and she said I shut them out, that they worry. That Cole just wants to protect what Grandpa built. And she didn't mention the months I cleaned the studio alone, the nights I drove that truck with a dying battery to sunrise sessions in the park, the certification course I paid for myself, the classes I taught for free just to get 3 human beings to trust the space again. She didn't mention any of that because it doesn't fit the narrative, and the narrative is their real inheritance, not the building, not the vehicle. The narrative that Cole is the golden child, and I'm the reliable shadow. And while they were talking, my mind kept doing this ugly rewind to the first time I understood how this family works, the moment when the rules became physical. When I was 11 and Cole broke my mother's favorite blue vase by sprinting through the entryway with a soccer ball, and he started crying before anyone even blamed him, like he already knew the ritual. Tears first, accountability never. And my father looked at me and asked why I didn't stop him, like I was a security guard, not a kid reading in the next room. And I got grounded and Cole got comforted, and I learned a lesson that followed me into adulthood. In this family, truth doesn't win, timing wins, and whoever cries first gets believed. So I stopped offering my truth like a gift to people who treat it like trash, and I became quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I needed to survive a house where my words could be twisted into evidence against me. Now look at me, years later, sitting in court, and they're doing the same thing with higher stakes, same tactic, different costume. They're calling me unstable the way they used to call me difficult. They're saying I can't manage a business the way they used to say I caused trouble. And they're using the court as their new living room, hoping the judge will play the role my parents always played. Believe Cole, punish Maya, keep the story consistent. Here's the part one want you to answer for yourself, because I'm not going to pretend this is rare. If your parents stood in a courtroom and tried to take what you built, would you still call it family loyalty if you were the one losing everything? Or would you finally call it what it is, theft with a smile? And if you've lived through something like this, tell me where you're watching from right now, because I read these comments, and I want to know how far this kind of betrayal travels, what state, what city, what country, and what would you do if the people who raised you tried to rewrite you as a problem so they could take your work? Because while they were testifying, the gallery was nodding like my parents were being reasonable, and that's how these stories spread, not through screaming villains, but through calm voices that frame control as care. I sat there and let them talk, because every time my father said Cole is the leader, he was admitting motive. Every time my mother said Maya is overwhelmed, she was admitting strategy. And every time Cole said I'm only trying to help, he was admitting that the help showed up only after the money did. And I watched Judge Sandoval's pen pause, just for a second, the way a person pauses when something finally doesn't add up. And I knew then the temperature in the room was about to change, because judges don't like being manipulated. They especially don't like when a family tries to use mental health language as a crowbar to pry assets out of someone's hands. And my parents had been sloppy. They had been so used to winning in the living room that they forgot. Court runs on records, dates, receipts, and the order of events. The plaintiff's attorney wrapped up with one last gentle speech about fairness, and Cole looked over at me with that faint smile that says, "You're going to fold like you always do." And my father leaned back like this was already decided, and my mother's hands rested in her lap like a saint who's done nothing wrong. Then the judge asked a few questions about the alleged verbal agreement, when it happened, where it happened, who was present, what exactly was said, and Cole answered too fast, my father answered too confidently, my mother answered too softly, and I kept my face still because I could feel my lawyer beside me waiting for the moment that matters most in any power play. The moment the other side thinks they finished, and then you show the part they didn't plan for, Judge Sandoval looked down again, flipped a page, and I saw it. That subtle shift, her eyes narrowing not at me, but at the pattern, like she'd finally noticed that their story had the same smell as every other greedy family dispute disguised as concern. And then she lifted her head and said my name in a way that wasn't gentle and wasn't cruel, just exact, like a door being unlocked. And I swear the courtroom got so quiet you could hear someone's bracelet clink in the back row. And before my attorney could even stand, the judge asked a question that made my father's smile twitch for the first time. Did I deny what had just been said, or was there something I hadn't told the court yet? And right then I realized my silence wasn't going to be their shield anymore. It was going to be the trap door under their feet, because I didn't walk into that courtroom with feelings. I walked in with timestamps, receipts, and one recording that turned family concern into exactly what it really was. Judge Sandoval said my name again, slower this time, like she was giving me one clean second to decide whether I was going to play the role my family wrote for me, or whether I was going to finally hand the court the real script. And I didn't rush to answer, because I've watched my father win arguments by speeding up the room, by forcing people to react before they can think. And I wasn't going to let him set the tempo in a place where facts are supposed to breathe. My attorney, Mr. Callahan, leaned in just enough that only I could hear him and whispered, "Let them finish hanging themselves." And I almost smiled, because that's exactly what I'd been doing, letting them talk until their story got too heavy to carry. The judge's eyes moved from me to my father and back again, and she said, "Miss Pierce, I'm asking you directly. Are you disputing the claim that you agreed to share ownership? And are you disputing the implication that you are unable to manage this business?" And you could feel the gallery lean forward the way people do when they think a quiet person is about to snap. And Cole's lawyer shifted his papers like he was ready to pounce on any emotion I showed. And my mother's face tightened into that practiced expression that says, "Be good, don't embarrass us." The same face she used when I was 10 and she made me apologize for something Cole did. I lifted my chin and kept my voice level, not soft, not shaky, not angry, and I said, "Your Honor, I deny there was any agreement, verbal or otherwise, and I deny that I'm unable to manage the business. I've managed it alone for over a year, and I can prove it." And the words landed clean, like a glass set down on a table, and I watched my father's mouth press into a thin line, because the moment I used the word prove, he knew we weren't in his living room anymore. Cole's lawyer stood up fast, all smooth confidence, and said, "Your Honor, the defense is welcome to make assertions, but we have testimony from 3 family members and a documented pattern of emotional strain." And he said, emotional strain like it was a diagnosis, like being tired after doing the work of 3 people is a moral failing. And he pivoted toward the judge with that little half-smile attorneys use when they want you to feel like the conclusion is obvious. Judge Sandoval didn't smile back. She just said, "Counsel, I'll hear evidence, not adjectives." And that sentence did something subtle in the room, because people who abuse language hate when you take their favorite weapon away. And my father's eyes flicked toward my attorney like, "How dare you bring someone who knows the rules?" Mr. Callahan rose slowly, no theatrics, and set a thin binder on the table, and I want you to picture it because this part matters. It wasn't a thick stack meant to overwhelm. It was organized, tabbed, clean, the kind of binder that says, "We anticipated your story and built a timeline that doesn't care how loudly you speak." He started with the simplest truth, the kind courts love because it's boring and bulletproof. And he said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff claims my client made a verbal agreement to transfer or share ownership. We're going to show the court that the first time the plaintiff ever demanded ownership was after the business turned profitable, and we will show that he contributed nothing financially and made repeated coercive statements to obtain the property." And Cole's lawyer objected immediately, argumentative. But the judge just said, "Lay your foundation." So Mr. Callahan did, step by step, like building a staircase out of receipts. First, he handed the court a set of text messages printed with timestamps and phone numbers visible, not screenshots with missing context, and he read them aloud because in a courtroom, reading someone's own words is like holding up a mirror they can't smash. The first message was from Cole to me, sent weeks after a local wellness blog featured my studio and bookings started filling, and it said, "Now that the studio is finally worth something, you need to stop acting selfish. We should split it." And the second one, 2 days later, said, "Dad agrees. Mom agrees. Sign something so it's official." And I watched Cole's neck get red because in his mind, family agreement was supposed to sound like moral authority, but on paper, it looked like what it was, a coordinated pressure campaign. My father shifted in his seat, and my mother stared at her hands, and I knew she recognized her own fingerprints on that message even though she didn't type it. Mr. Callahan didn't stop there. He laid out the timeline for the judge like he was teaching a child how to spot a con. He said, "These messages begin after the business shows measurable growth. There are no messages before that indicating any agreement, no emails, no letters, no notes, nothing." And then he passed forward my bank statements and invoices, and again, picture the detail. Receipts from a flooring supplier for sanding materials, paint invoices, HVAC service calls, a set of new props ordered in batches, a payment plan for mirrors being replaced, a mechanic's invoice for new tires and brake pads for the studio truck, and every single one had my name, my card, my signature. Not Cole's, not my father's, not my mother's. Cole's lawyer tried to pivot. Contributions can be non-financial. And Mr. Callahan calmly asked, "Then please identify any non-financial contribution before profitability that supports a claim of ownership." And that's when you could hear the quiet little friction in the room, because they didn't have an answer that wasn't just vibes. Judge Sandoval asked Cole directly, "Mr. Pierce, did you ever teach a class, maintain the property, pay for repairs, purchase equipment, or manage client scheduling prior to your request to share ownership?" And Cole did that thing entitled people do when they're cornered. He started broad. I offered help, and the judge cut through it. "That wasn't my question." So he tried again. I gave advice, and she asked, "Advice documented where?" And he had nothing but air. My father leaned forward then and tried to rescue him with the old trick, the emotional angle. "Your Honor, she's always been overwhelmed. She isolates. She doesn't accept support." And that's when Mr. Callahan looked at the judge and said, "Your Honor, we anticipated this framing because the plaintiff's case isn't built on ownership law, it's built on character assassination." And I swear you could feel the gallery stiffen because people don't like to admit when they've been manipulated, but they also don't like seeing it exposed. Then came the moment my father didn't know existed, the one I've been holding like a match behind my back. The recording, Mr. Callahan said, "Your Honor, we have an audio recording of a phone call between my client and the plaintiff, recorded lawfully, that demonstrates coercion and threats tied to the transfer." And Cole's lawyer jumped up. "Objection, authenticity, and prejudice." And the judge asked, "Is there a chain of custody?" And Mr. Callahan said, "Yes, Your Honor." And he explained, without drama, that I recorded the call because I felt unsafe and pressured, that the file had metadata, that it had not been altered, and that Cole's voice could be authenticated by the plaintiff himself. Judge Sandoval leaned back slightly and said, "Play it." And the courtroom, which had been buzzing with that low human sound of gossip and judgment, went silent in a way that made the air feel thin. My attorney pressed a button and Cole's voice filled the room. Too clear, too casual, and he said, "Just sign the papers, Maya. You're not going to run this forever. You're too fragile for this. Sign now before I have to sue you and make you look crazy." And then my own voice came through, steady but tight. "Stop calling me fragile." And Cole laughed, a short laugh like he was talking to a child, and said, "I'm trying to help you. Dad says you'll burn out. Mom says you're unstable when you're stressed. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. And when that line hit, I watched the judge's eyes narrow, because that wasn't concern. That was a threat wrapped in family language. The recording ended, and the silence afterward was heavy, not emotional, factual, like a door slamming shut on their story. Cole's lawyer started to speak, probably about context, probably about frustration. But Judge Sandoval held up her hand and asked Cole a single question that made his throat bob when he swallowed. "Mr. Pierce, is that your voice?" And he whispered, "Yes," and she asked, "Do you deny making those statements?" And he tried, "I was upset." And the judge said, "Upset is not a legal justification for coercion." And then she turned to my father, and this part felt like watching a bully realize the teacher is finally paying attention, and she said, "Mr. and Mrs. Pierce, you signed affidavits supporting an alleged agreement and alleging your daughter's instability. Do you still stand by those affidavits in light of this recording and the financial documents showing she alone built the business?" And my father opened his mouth, and for the first time all morning, nothing confident came out, just a stumble. "We thought, we believed." And the judge leaned forward slightly and said, "Belief is not evidence." And then she looked down at the paperwork again, tapped a page with her pen, and said, "Counsel for plaintiff, your filing also states the defendant has a pattern of concerning behavior and should not be solely responsible for assets." "What exactly did you mean by that?" And Cole's lawyer started to talk about emotional strain, about isolation, about family concern, but the judge didn't let him float. She anchored him. What incidents? What dates? What reports? What objective proof? And he had none, because the only proof was the story they'd been telling about me since childhood, and stories don't hold up under a judge's questions. Mr. Callahan sat back down, calm, like he'd just placed the last piece on a chessboard, and I felt something strange in my chest. Not triumph, not joy, more like relief mixed with grief, because it shouldn't take a courtroom for a family to stop lying about you. But sometimes the only way to survive people like this is to force reality into a format they can't argue with. Judge Sandoval called for a short recess, and as she stood, she looked directly at me and said, "Miss Pierce, remain available." And then she looked at my father and said, "Mr. Pierce, you as well." And my father's jaw clenched because he could sense what was coming, and on the way out, Cole hissed under his breath, "You recorded me?" Like the betrayal in his mind was me protecting myself, not him trying to steal. In the hallway, my mother brushed past me without eye contact, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume, and it hit me like a memory of every time she chose peace with my father over truth for me. And my attorney leaned in and said, "They just lost control of the narrative." And I nodded, but my hands were cold, because I knew families like mine don't stop when they lose. They escalate. They change angles. They find new ways to punish you for not staying small. And as we waited for the judge to return, my phone buzzed with a single new voicemail notification from an unknown number, and my stomach tightened because I had a feeling it wasn't a friend wishing me luck. It was the next move in their game, the one they'd been saving for the moment the courtroom stopped believing them. The voicemail sat on my screen like a drop of ink spreading in water, and for a second I didn't even breathe because I knew my parents' style. They don't fight with fists. They fight with paperwork and whispers and concern. And then my attorney, Mr. Callahan, glanced at my face and said, "Don't listen to it alone." Like he'd seen this exact move before, and I almost laughed at how insane that sentence is in normal life. Because who needs a lawyer to supervise a voicemail? But this wasn't normal life. This was my family treating court like a stage. The bailiff called us back in. Judge Sandoval took her seat, and the room snapped into attention like a dog hearing its name, and she looked down at her notes and said, "I'm prepared to rule." And my father's shoulders lifted like he was about to receive a trophy, because men like him always assume the universe will confuse confidence with correctness. The judge started with the boring part that ruins liars, the timeline. The plaintiff's claim hinges on an alleged verbal agreement, she said. Yet the first documented demands for shared ownership appear only after the business became profitable, and she held up the printed texts like they were contaminated evidence, and then she said, "The defendant's financial records show sole responsibility for improvements, repairs, and operations." And then she paused, eyes moving to Cole, and the recorded call suggests coercion rather than concern, and I watched Cole's face go from smug to shiny, like a thin layer of sweat had formed under his skin. Judge Sandoval leaned forward and said, "Mr. Pierce, you called your sister fragile while threatening litigation to force a transfer of property. Do you understand how that undermines your credibility?" And Cole did the classic pivot, the helpless little boy act. "I was trying to help," and the judge said, "Help does not require ownership." And that line got a quiet murmur from the gallery, like people were realizing they'd been nodding along to something ugly. Then she turned to my father. "Mr. Pierce, your affidavit states you witnessed a conversation in which your daughter agreed to share ownership." And my father tried to sound offended. "I did." And she asked, "When? Where? Who else was present? What words were used?" And you could see the problem, because you can't freestyle facts under a judge's questions. You either know it or you don't. And my father's answers started getting foggy. It was around the holidays, maybe at dinner. And the judge said, "Which holiday?" And he said, "Thanksgiving or Christmas." And she looked at him for a long beat and said, "Those are not the same." And I swear I felt something in the room shift from family dispute to someone lied under oath. My mother finally spoke, voice soft like she was offering tea. "Your Honor, we only want what's fair." And Judge Sandoval didn't raise her voice. She just said, "Fairness is not a substitute for evidence." And then she delivered the ruling like a door closing. The plaintiff has not met the burden of proof. The claim is denied in full. Miss Pierce retains sole ownership of the yoga studio and associated vehicle, and that should have been the end. Right. Credits roll. Justice. Deep breath. But here's what I need you to understand. People like my parents don't lose and then go home quietly. They treat a loss as permission to go lower. And that's exactly what happened next, because Cole's lawyer stood up immediately and said, "Your Honor, we request the court consider a protective order regarding the defendant's conduct and her access to financial accounts." And my brain almost short-circuited at the audacity, because they'd just lost the ownership claim and they were already trying to slap a different label on me, a new trap. And Judge Sandoval's eyes narrowed. "On what basis?" And the lawyer said, "We have concerns about mental stability and impulsive decisions." And I felt heat rise behind my ribs, not because it hurt, but because it was disgusting. It was the same script they've used since I was a child. She's emotional. She's unstable. She needs control. And then my father added, too quickly, she isolates. She doesn't sleep. She records calls. She's paranoid. And I almost laughed because listen to that. The evidence of my instability was that I protected myself and worked hard and didn't invite them into my life to sabotage it. Judge Sandoval tapped her pen once and said, "The defendant recording a call where coercion occurred is not evidence of instability. It is evidence of caution." And then she turned to them and said, "If you wish to pursue a protective order, you may file a separate action with appropriate evidence. I will not entertain it here as a retaliation for losing." And that word retaliation hit my father like a slap, because he's never called what he does by its real name. And then, like a movie villain who can't help himself, he did the thing that always exposes the true motive. He stood up without being asked and said, "Your Honor, the point is she doesn't deserve it. Cole has a family. He has the leadership. She just teaches stretching." And the gallery made this little sound, half laugh, half gasp, because imagine belittling your own daughter's work in front of a judge like it's cute. And Judge Sandoval's voice went colder. "Mr. Pierce, sit down." And he sat, but his face was tight with rage, because when control leaves their hands, they start showing teeth. And that's when my phone buzzed again in my purse. And I knew without looking that it was that voicemail sitting there, waiting like a planted device, and Mr. Callahan leaned close and whispered, "If they're escalating, we document everything." And then he said something that made my stomach drop. "They may try adult guardianship next." And that phrase might sound dramatic if you've never seen it, but if you have, you know it's one of the nastiest legal tools in the world when it's weaponized, because it's not about money anymore. It's about saying you're not competent to own your own life. The judge called the matter closed, and the bailiff dismissed us, and the room started moving again, chairs scraping, whispers restarting, and as I stood, Cole's eyes met mine for the first time all day without a smile, and he mouthed, "This isn't over," like he was promising a sequel. Outside the courtroom, my mother finally spoke to me, not with apology, not with love, but with that syrupy control voice. "Maya, let's talk like adults." And I said, "Adults don't file lies in court." And she flinched like I'd slapped her then. Immediately recovered and looked at Mr. Callahan and said, "She's being aggressive." And I turned to you in my head right there because I know some of you have lived this exact moment, where you finally speak one clean sentence and they call it aggression because it threatens their story. Mr. Callahan guided me down the hall and said, "Don't engage." But my father followed, not too close, just close enough to be heard, and he said, "You humiliated us." And I stopped walking, turned, and said, "No. You tried to steal from me," and the judge noticed, and the look on his face was pure insult, like accountability was rude. And then, right there in the courthouse hallway, my father did something so small but so telling. He leaned toward a woman I didn't recognize, someone with a badge clipped to her bag, and he said loudly, "She's been having episodes." And that's when the woman's eyes flicked to me with a professional kind of curiosity. And my attorney's posture changed, shoulders squaring. Because he recognized the move too, he stepped between us and said, "Ma'am, my client is represented. If you are here in any official capacity, direct all communication to counsel." And the woman held up her hands and said, "I'm just here for another matter." But her eyes kept tracking me like she was storing my face. "And now tell me, what would you do if you realized your own family was trying to plant you into a system as unwell, just to control your property?" Because that's the moment it stopped being a family fight and became a safety issue. And if you're watching this and you've been through anything like it, do me a favor right now. Tap subscribe and join this community, because the comments on stories like this turn into a support group and a strategy room at the same time. And you'd be shocked how many people are living the same script in silence. I got to my car, and my hands were steady, but my chest felt tight, like I'd swallowed a stone, and Mr. Callahan stood by my driver's side and said, "Now we listen to the voicemail." And he hit speaker, and the voice that came through wasn't my father or my mother or Cole. It was a man, calm, professional, the kind of voice that makes people comply before they even realize it. And he said, "This message is for Maya Pierce. My name is Dr. Harlan Keene. I've been contacted by your family regarding urgent concerns about your mental health and your ability to care for yourself and manage your affairs. Please return my call as soon as possible to discuss an evaluation." And I felt my stomach drop because it wasn't a threat in the usual way. It was wrapped in credentials, and Mr. Callahan didn't even blink. He just said, "There it is," like he'd call the next play, and then he asked me, "Have you ever met that doctor?" And I said, "Never." And he nodded and said, "Then they're building a file." And my mind flashed through every text I'd ever sent late at night, every tired message, every time I said, "I'm exhausted," because now I could see what they were doing. They were collecting normal human fatigue and labeling it pathology. I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the steering wheel like it might explain how people who raised you can turn into prosecutors. And then my phone lit up with a new email notification, subject line, "Immediate family meeting," and underneath it my mother had written, "We love you." but we need to step in before you ruin your life." And I laughed. Once, a short, ugly laugh, because the love always shows up right before the knife, and Mr. Callahan said, "Do not respond." And then he added, "Go straight to your studio, change your locks, and we start documenting a harassment pattern today." And as I started the car, my phone buzzed again, a new text from Cole, just 5 words, and they were the kind of 5 words that sound like nothing until you understand the trap. I already talked to someone, and my hands tightened on the wheel because I knew exactly what someone meant now, and I also knew the next time I walked into my studio, there might be a stranger waiting inside acting like they had authority over me. The drive to the studio felt like I was steering through 2 worlds at once. The normal world where people argue over parking spots and coffee orders, and the other world where your own family is quietly trying to put your name next to words like evaluation and unable and risk. And then I pulled into my lot and noticed something so small it almost didn't register. My front door was not fully latched, not open, not broken, just slightly not seated the way I always leave it, and my body went cold because when you've been raised by control freaks, you learn the difference between chaos and a deliberate touch. I didn't rush in like a movie hero. I did what Mr. Callahan told me to do. I stopped, I looked around, I checked my mirrors, and then I called him, and he answered like he was waiting. "Do not go inside if anything looks off." And I said, "Door's not latched." And he said, "Good. Now we treat this like evidence." And then he had me do the most boring, important thing in the world. Take photos, wide shot of the door, close-up of the latch, photo of the threshold, photo of the lock. And then he said, "Call non-emergency. Request an officer to meet you for a civil standby." And I could feel the humiliation trying to creep up. Like, why should I need a cop to enter my own business? And then I reminded myself, humiliation is what they want, because embarrassed people rush and rushed people make mistakes. The dispatcher asked questions in that neutral voice. "Is anyone inside? Do you see forced entry?" And I said, "Unknown." And then I sat in my car with my hands on the wheel, watching the glass front of my studio reflect the sky, and I kept thinking about Cole's text. I already talked to someone because those 5 words were like a match dropped into gasoline, and then I heard tires on gravel and a patrol car rolled in, lights off, slow, and the officer stepped out and glanced at my building the way you look at a place you already have a story about. And that's when my stomach tightened because I could see it in his posture. He wasn't coming in blank. He was coming in preloaded. He introduced himself, Officer Rains, polite enough, and then he said, "Ma'am, we got a call about a welfare concern," and I didn't even blink because there it was, the someone. I kept my voice level. "From who?" And he did the dance. "I can't disclose that." And I said, "It's my family." And he paused just long enough to confirm it without saying yes. And then he asked, "Are you alone?" And I almost laughed because it's such an innocent question until you realize it's a box on a form, and I said, "Yes, and I'm fine." And then I handed him my phone and said, "I have a voicemail from a doctor claiming my family contacted him about an evaluation. I have recent court documents showing they attempted to take my business and lost. I want this noted." And you could see his eyes flicker because now he had 2 competing narratives, the family's concern and my pattern. And the moment you give an authority figure a pattern with receipts, they start moving differently. He asked if I wanted him to walk inside with me, and I said yes, and we approached the door together. He tried the handle and it opened too easily, and he looked at me like, "Okay, that's real." And then we stepped into the lobby, and the air hit us. That warm mixed smell of eucalyptus spray and rubber mats and old wood, and nothing looked smashed, nothing looked stolen. But the front desk drawer was slightly open, not dumped, just open, and on the counter was a manila folder I had never seen before, placed neatly like someone wanted me to find it. Officer Rains didn't touch it. He pointed with 2 fingers. "Is that yours?" And I said, "No." And my chest got tight because it's one thing to be lied about. It's another thing to have a physical object planted in your space. I took a photo first, then I put on gloves from my car. Yes, I keep a little emergency kit because I'm that person, and then I opened the folder, and my mouth went dry because inside were printed screenshots of my text to Cole from months ago. The ones where I said I was tired and one where I said, "I can't do this with you in my face." And then there were printed emails from my booking platform showing late-night replies to clients, and then, sitting right on top, like a crown, was a one-page wellness assessment request form with my name typed in and the signature line blank, and the provider listed as Dr. Harlan Keene. I didn't have to be a lawyer to understand the play. They were trying to create the illusion of a file that already existed, so that when the next authority figure showed up, they could say, "See? She's been under review." And Officer Rain said quietly, "How would someone get into your studio?" And I said, "They wouldn't unless they had a key." And then my brain went straight to the spare key. The one I kept hidden for emergencies in a little magnetic box under the back steps. And I felt stupid for even trusting the world with it. And then I checked and the box was gone, cleanly removed, not ripped off, just taken, and it hit me like a wave because this wasn't random. This was planned, and it wasn't just family drama. It was intrusion, manipulation, and setup. Officer Rains asked if I wanted to make a report, and I said yes. And then he asked if anyone else had access to keys. And I told him the truth I hated saying out loud, my parents. And he nodded like he'd heard that answer more times than any of us want to believe. And then he said, "We need to talk about that welfare call." And I could tell he wanted to be careful, like he didn't want to insult me, but he also didn't want to ignore protocol, and he asked, "Are you thinking about harming yourself or anyone else?" And I said, "No." And I held his eyes while I said it, because you cannot sound defensive here. You sound factual. And then I added, "This is retaliation. They lost in court today. They're trying to paint me unstable to control my assets." And then something happened that made my skin prickle. The front door opened behind us and a woman walked in carrying a clipboard like she belonged there. Nice blouse, calm smile. And she said, "Maya Pierce," like she was calling me from a waiting room. And Officer Rains immediately stepped slightly between us and asked, "Ma'am, who are you?" And she smiled wider. "I'm with Keene Behavioral Services. I'm here for a wellness check." And my heart did that sick little drop because they didn't just call a doctor. They sent someone to my business like it was a scheduled appointment. And I said, "I did not request that." And she kept smiling like that didn't matter. "Your family is worried. We just need to ask a few questions." And I heard Mr. Callahan's voice in my head. "Do not engage, document." And then I looked at Officer Rains and said, "I am declining." I want her to leave. And he told her, "Ma'am, she's declining. You need to leave." And the woman's smile thinned. "We're mandated reporters," she said, trying to pull authority from thin air, and Officer Rains didn't bite. "You're on private property. She has counsel. Leave." And the woman's eyes flicked to the folder on the counter, like she'd expected it to do the heavy lifting for her. And then she said, "I'll note that she refused." And I almost laughed again because even the refusal becomes a tool in their hands. And then she turned to go, and as she walked out, she said casually, "Someone should make sure she's not driving while distressed." And it was such a subtle poison line, such a quiet seed planted for the next person. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about making me look unstable in court anymore. It was about creating a trail of concerns across different systems so that eventually one of those systems would do what my parents couldn't do directly. Officer Rains finished taking my statement, and before he left he said, "Change your locks today. No more spare keys. And if anyone shows up saying they're here for your welfare, ask for credentials and call your attorney." And I thanked him, and then I called Mr. Callahan back and told him everything. The door, the planted folder, the missing spare key, the wellness worker, and he went quiet for a beat and then said, "They escalated." And his voice got sharper. "We're filing for a protective order, and we're sending a formal notice to that clinic that any further contact is unwelcome and will be treated as harassment." And I stood in the middle of my studio looking at the mirrors, and I felt this strange split inside me. Half of me wanted to cry, not because I was weak, but because it's a particular kind of grief when the people who should protect you become the people you have to protect yourself from. And then the other half of me felt something hard and steady, because they had crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. I started moving, because action is oxygen in moments like this. I locked the door, pulled the curtains, and then I walked to the back and opened my storage closet and pulled out the binder I never told them about. The one where I keep every receipt, every repair invoice, every bank statement, every permit, every registration, every single boring page that proves I built this. And as I flipped through it, my phone lit up with a new email from an unknown address, subject line, guardianship inquiry. And when I opened it, it was one sentence, polite and terrifying. We have been asked to advise on whether Ms. Maya Pierce is able to manage her personal and financial affairs. And that's when I understood the next move wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be official. The first thing I did after reading Guardianship Inquiry wasn't panic, it was inventory, because panic makes you dramatic and drama is exactly the costume they want to dress you in. So I stood there with the email open and I asked myself one simple question. What would a judge believe if they only saw paperwork and never saw my face? And then I started building the version of me that paperwork could not distort. I called Mr. Callahan, and I didn't give him a speech, I gave him a timeline. Because timelines beat emotions every day of the week. Court ended at 2:17. I arrived at the studio at 3:04, door unlatched, spare key missing. Wellness workers showed up at 3:41. Officer Raines documented it. And now at 4:12, I received this guardianship email. And Callahan went quiet in that lawyer way where you can hear him flipping legal drawers in his mind. And then he said, "Forward it to me. Do not respond." And I said, "Already done." And I forwarded it with a clean subject line, potential guardianship harassment. And then he said the sentence that made the air feel heavier. They're trying to create urgency. Guardianship lives on urgency. And that's the part most people don't understand until it's too late. Guardianship isn't always about someone being incapable. It's about someone convincing the court they have to act fast for your protection. And once a court starts protecting you, it can take years to prove you don't need saving. Callahan told me to lock down my accounts immediately, not tomorrow. Not when I had time now. And I did it right there at the front desk, like my studio turned into a command center. I opened my banking app, changed passwords, turned on two-factor authentication, called the bank's fraud line, and asked them to put a verbal passphrase on my account so nobody could call in and sweet-talk a rep using my birthday and mother's maiden name, because family members know the answers. And then I called my booking platform and told them I wanted no changes without written verification for my email plus a phone call to my number. And the rep sounded confused. At first, until I said, "I'm dealing with family harassment," and her tone shifted to that careful sympathy workers get when they've seen this movie before. Then I did the part that felt ridiculous until I remembered the folder on my counter. I took my studio's guest sign-in sheet, my class schedule, and the cash log, and I put them in a locked drawer, and I took photos of the inside of that drawer with the documents visible. Because if anything went missing later, I wanted before and after, and then I walked out back and stood beside the truck like it was a living witness, and I took a video, slow pan, license plate, VIN sticker, mileage, the fresh tires I bought, the repairs I paid for, because my brother's entire strategy depended on rewriting ownership as something shared or mismanaged, and nothing kills that faster than clear documentation that screams one word: consistent. The next call I made was to the clinic name on the email, and I know you're thinking, why would you call them? But I didn't call to argue, I called to force a record, because institutions don't care about your feelings, but they do care about liability. And when you speak like a calm adult documenting harassment, you become difficult to misuse. The receptionist answered with that sing-song script voice, "Thank you for calling." And I said, "My name is Maya Pierce. I received an email titled Guardianship Inquiry from your domain. I did not request services. I am asking for the compliance officer or office manager." And she said, "May I ask what this is regarding?" And I said, "An unwanted outreach connected to a family dispute and a false welfare referral." and the line went quiet for a second like she was deciding whether to treat me as a customer or a problem, and then she put me on hold. I waited, staring at the mirrors, watching my own face in them, and it hit me how cruel it is that the quietest people are the easiest to label, because silence looks like submission if you don't know the difference between peace and fear. A man came on, office manager voice, calm but guarded, and I repeated it slowly. I did not request services. I am not interested in an evaluation. I am formally requesting no further contact. If you've been approached by my family, you've been given a false narrative. I have counsel, and he tried to keep it neutral. We simply received a request for information, and I said, "From who?" And he did what Officer Raines did. "I can't disclose that." And I said, "Then document this." I am denying consent. I am requesting a copy of any intake notes that include my name. And I am asking you to preserve all communications and caller ID records related to this inquiry. And there was a pause, and then he said, "Ma'am, we can't release information without verification." And I said, "Perfect. I'll have my attorney send a letter today. But I want you to understand, if you proceed based on a third party's claims without my consent, you're stepping into a harassment situation." And he didn't argue after that. He said, "Understood." And I hung up and immediately wrote down the time, the name he gave me, and the exact phrases he used, because the trick with these situations is you treat everything like it will be repeated in front of a judge, because sometimes it will. Then my phone buzzed again, and my stomach tightened because I expected another email, another ambush, another concern. But it was a text from my mother, and it was almost laughable how she pivoted from clapping in court to pretending to care. "Sweetheart, please answer. We're worried. People say you're not sleeping. We just want what's best for you." And I stared at it, because if you've lived with gaslighting parents, you know the script. They don't accuse you directly in writing. They imply. They invite you to defend yourself, because defense becomes proof you're unstable. I didn't respond, and then she sent another one. "Your brother is willing to forgive you. Let's do this peacefully. Forgive me." Like I'd robbed them, like building a business with my own hands was a crime that required their mercy. I forwarded both texts to Callahan without comment, and then I did the part that felt like swallowing nails. I called a friend. Not because I needed comfort, because I needed a witness, and I chose Mrs. Ellison, one of my older regulars who has the kind of steady presence that makes chaos behave. And when she answered, I said, "I need a favor. Can you come sit in the lobby for a bit while I change locks and make calls? I don't want to be alone if anyone shows up." And she didn't ask for the gossip first. She said, "I'm on my way." And 20 minutes later, she walked in with her purse tucked under her arm like a shield, and she looked around at the space I'd built and said, "This place is too calm for the mess people try to bring into it." And I almost cried at that, because she saw me, not their story. While she sat in the lobby, I called a locksmith, and I didn't say my family. I said unauthorized key. Access, because that gets you faster service. And when he arrived, he looked at my door and said, "Someone's been using this latch gently, not forcing it." And I said, "That's what I thought." And he replaced the cylinder and handed me new keys, and I told him there would be no spare left outside. And he nodded like he approved, and then I installed a door camera, not a fancy security system. Just a simple camera with cloud storage, because the next tactic after paperwork is drop-ins. And drop-ins are designed to push you into saying something sharp that can be repackaged as unhinged. While the locksmith worked, Mrs. Ellison made tea in the little corner I built for students, and she said, "Maya, I'm going to ask you one question, and I want an honest answer. Are you afraid of them? Or are you afraid of what they'll convince other people to believe?" And I didn't even have to think. I said, "The second one." Because that's the nightmare, not their anger, their influence. The way they can walk into an office with a concerned face and make strangers treat you like a problem. And then, right on cue, my brother called, and I didn't pick up, but he left a voicemail, and his voice had that fake calm he uses when he's trying to sound like the adult. "Maya, you're spiraling. Everyone can see it. You're making things hard. Just agree to a shared management plan, and this all goes away. And there it was, the trade, your freedom for his control. And then he added, softer, nastier. If you keep refusing help, you're going to force us to take steps. And that word steps landed like a threat wearing loafers. I played the voicemail on speaker so Mrs. Ellison could hear it. Not because I needed validation, but because I needed another person to hear the coercion plainly. And when it ended, she shook her head and said, "That's not love. That's a takeover." And she was right. A little later, Callahan texted me a short list that looked like nothing, but it was a lifeline. Do not meet them alone. Do not sign anything. Do not engage with clinics. Document every contact. And then he wrote, I'm filing an emergency motion for a protective order and requesting the court admonish them against harassment and false reporting. And I felt something shift, because until then it had felt like I was reacting, but now we were moving. And then another email came in, and I watched the subject line appear like a snake head rising from grass. Notice of petition. And my throat went dry as I opened it, because it wasn't from the clinic this time. It was from a paralegal at a law office I didn't recognize, and the message was polite, almost cheerful. We have been retained by your family to explore conservatorship options due to concerns about your capacity and financial decisions. And then it listed reasons that were so twisted they almost sounded reasonable to a stranger. Long work hours, isolation, refusing family support, impulsive spending on renovations, emotional reactivity, and the punchline was at the bottom. We request you submit to an independent evaluation within 72 hours to avoid filing. And I just sat there looking at it, because 72 hours isn't a deadline, it's a trap. A countdown designed to force you into a rush step that can be spun later as noncompliance. And I turned to Mrs. Ellison and said, they're giving me 72 hours. And she said, then we don't waste one. And my phone buzzed again. This time it was Callahan calling, and the first thing he said was, do not respond to that email. Forward it. We're going to respond through counsel, and we're going to flip the script. And I said, how? And he said, by showing the court they're abusing the process to steal assets. And he paused, and then he said the thing that made my pulse jump. And I'm requesting the judge order them to stop contacting third parties about you, because they already lied in court once. And when I hung up, I looked around my studio, the mats stacked neatly, the soft lights, the quiet smell of clean wood, and I realized the fight wasn't just about property anymore. It was about identity, because if they could brand me as unstable, they could justify anything. And then my door camera pinged, motion detected, and I opened the app, and there they were in the parking lot, my parents' car, my father stepping out with a folder in his hand like he was heading into a meeting, my mother smoothing her scarf like she was going to church, and my brother behind them with that same calm smile he wore in court. And I watched them walk toward my front door, like they still own my life. They didn't knock like normal people, they knocked like they own the air in the room. 3 sharp taps that said, we're not visiting, we're collecting. And I watched them through the door camera while my brain did that fast math it does when danger wears a friendly face. Because if I opened the door, they'd step inside and control the scene, and if I didn't open, they'd turn it into proof that I was unstable. So I chose the third option. The option they never planned for. I opened the door too. Inches with a chain latched and my phone recording in my hand, and I smiled like a hostess at a funeral. You can't come in, I said, not loud, not shaky, just clean, and my father immediately put on that gentle concerned voice like a sweater he saves for authority figures. Maya, we just want to talk. And my brother stood half a step behind him with a folder tucked under his arm, because of course he brought paper. Paper is his favorite weapon, and my mother did that small sad face like she was auditioning for the role of hurt parent, and she said, sweetheart, you're scaring us. And I almost laughed because the only thing I'd done was lock my own door, but I didn't laugh. I stayed calm and said, you're being recorded and you're not coming in. And my father's eyes flicked to my phone and back, and his smile tightened for a second. just a hair, and that tiny shift told me everything. He didn't mind confrontation. He minded evidence. My brother stepped forward like a mediator. In a family meeting that he scheduled without my consent, "Maya, we have a solution," he said, and he lifted the folder a little, not like a threat, like a gift. "It's a temporary management agreement. It's just to help you." And I said, "Slide it under the door." And he blinked because he wanted to hand it to me. He wanted my fingerprints, my signature, my compliance, and when I repeated it, "under the door," my father sighed like I was being difficult on purpose. "Why are you acting like this?" And that line, that exact line, has ended more women's peace than any actual crime, because it forces you to defend your tone instead of holding your boundary. So I didn't defend my tone, I defended the facts. "You filed a petition in court to take my property. You contacted a clinic about guardianship. You told people I'm unstable. We are past talk." And my mother's mouth opened like she was going to cry, then closed when she realized tears don't work on a chain lock, and she tried a different tactic, sweet and venomous. "You always do this," she said softly. "You make everything a legal battle." And I almost said, "You made it legal the moment you dragged my name into court," but I didn't, because I could feel my heartbeat climbing and I refused to give them heat. Heat is what they bottle and hand to a judge as see. So I breathed through my nose, slow, and said, "If you're here to serve papers, put them under the door. If you're here to threaten me, say it clearly on camera." And that was when my father's face changed, not angry, offended, like I'd broken the family's unspoken rule. The one that says children don't document parents, children don't protect themselves from parents, children don't treat parents like strangers with motives. But that's the thing. Once your parents start moving like predators, you stop treating them like family, and you start treating them like risk. My brother crouched and tried to slide the folder under the door anyway, but the folder was too thick, and there was a tiny stupid moment where the corner snagged on the threshold and he tugged, and it ripped a little, and I swear to you, if this were a sitcom, there would have been laugh track right there, because watching a grown man in court shoes wrestling a manila folder like it's a wild animal is ridiculous. But then my father snapped, "Dylan, stop." And my brother stood up quickly, cheeks flushed, and he said, "Fine." And he raised his voice a notch so anyone in the parking lot could hear, "Maya is refusing help." And I felt my stomach drop because there it was, the performance, the public narrative. He wanted a witness, a passerby, a neighbor, someone later saying, "I saw them try to help her and she wouldn't let them in." And I leaned closer to the crack in the door and said, still calm, "This isn't help. This is an attempt to control my business. Leave." And my father lifted his folder and tapped it like a gavel. "We have documents," he said. "We have concerns and the court is going to see them." And I said, "My attorney will see them." And that's when my mother switched again, fast. "You have an attorney now?" she asked, like I joined a gang, like hiring counsel was proof of madness, and my father did that little head shake, disappointed dad theater. "This is what we mean," he said. "You're isolating, you're paranoid." And I said, "You called a clinic to talk about conservatorship. That's not paranoia. That's a fact." And my brother's eyes hardened, and he leaned forward and said in a low voice, "You're making yourself look worse." And I said, "I'm making myself look documented." And he flinched because he heard it. He heard the shift. He realized I wasn't the quiet daughter at the table anymore. I was the adult with a chain lock and a camera and a lawyer, and they hate that version of you because it removes their favorite tool, which is rewriting what happened. My father tried one last approach, the spiritual one, because they always go spiritual when legal isn't landing. "Your grandfather would be ashamed," he said, and I felt a hot sting in my chest because it was so wrong, it was almost comical. The man who left me his keys would be ashamed that I'm keeping them, right? And I said, "My grandfather gave me the studio because I showed up." "You showed up when it was profitable." And my mother whispered, "How dare you?" And I said, "How dare you file guardianship threats to take a yoga studio?" And then my father did something I didn't expect. He stepped back and raised his hands like he was calming an animal. "Okay," he said, Okay, we'll go. And for a second, I almost believed the act. And that's when my brother dropped his voice and said, "We'll do it the hard way then." And he turned and walked to his car, and my father followed, and my mother lingered half a second, looking at me through the crack like she wanted to memorize my face. And she said softly, "When they come, don't say we didn't warn you." And then she turned and got in the car. The second their tires rolled out of the lot, I locked the deadbolt, slid my phone into my pocket, and my hands finally started shaking, not from fear of them, but from the sick awareness of what comes next, because people who threaten conservatorship don't stop at threats. They escalate to third parties, they recruit systems, cops, doctors, banks, anyone who will listen, and they do it under the mask of concern, and that mask is hard to rip off once it sticks. Mrs. Ellison stood up from the lobby chair, eyes wide, and she said, "They looked like they were serving an eviction," and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and said, "They were serving a story." And then I did the most important thing you do after a confrontation like that. I documented it while it was fresh. I opened my notes app and typed the date, time, who was present, what was said, exact quotes, because details fade and family counts on that. They count on you remembering it as a blur so they can later say, "She's exaggerating." And then I emailed the clip from my door camera to Callahan with one sentence. They came to the studio. Here's the recording. And then I called the non-emergency police line and asked for an officer to take an informational report. Not because I thought the police would arrest my parents for being manipulative, but because I wanted a time-stamped public record that they showed up after the guardianship emails and pressured me to sign papers. And when the dispatcher asked, "Is anyone in immediate danger?" I said, "No, but I need documentation of harassment and attempted coercion." And she paused and said, "Okay," like she'd heard this exact wording before. And 40 minutes later, Officer Rains returned, same steady face. And I handed him my phone and said, "This is the video. This is what they said." And he watched it without reacting. And then he looked at me and said, "You did the right thing not opening the door." And I said, "I'm trying not to get painted as crazy." And he nodded slowly and said, "Then keep doing what you're doing."
Calm. Documented.
Through counsel, and he wrote the report number on his card and slid it to me, and that little card felt like armor. After he left, Callahan called me back, and his tone had changed from strategy to urgency. "They just gave us a gift," he said, and I said, "By showing up?" And he said, "By threatening you on camera." And then he explained the next move like he was laying out chess pieces. We were going to file for a protective order, attach the video, attach the clinic email, attach the lawyer. Email demanding an evaluation in 72 hours, attach the earlier court transcript, and then request the judge issue an order that barred them from contacting third parties about my capacity or my business. And while we were at it, we were going to request sanctions for bad faith filings, and I asked him the question that matters to every person watching this. Can they actually do it? And he didn't sugarcoat it. He said, "Anyone can file." That's the scary part. Winning is harder. But you have to treat it like a real threat, because even a weak petition can wreck your life if it gets traction. And then he added, "And Maya, I need you to do something tonight." And I said, "What?" And he said, "I need you to get a capacity letter from your primary care physician or therapist if you have one. Not because you're unstable, but because we're cutting their narrative off at the knees." And I hated that. I hated that I had to prove sanity because my parents were greedy, but I also understood the game. Courts move on paperwork, and if they brought a stack saying concerns, we were going to bring a stack saying facts. So I made the appointment. I sent the request through my patient portal. I asked for a brief letter stating I'm oriented, capable of managing finances, no diagnosis impairing judgment, and I kept the wording neutral because neutral is credibility. Then I did something else smart. I called my bank again and asked them to add a note. No third-party inquiries about capacity or account control without in-person verification. And the rep hesitated like that wasn't standard, and I said, "This is a documented harassment situation." And she said, "Okay." And it went in, and I felt a little safer. Late that night, when the studio was quiet, I sat alone on the floor under the mirror lights, and I did a quick mental replay of everything my family had done, not to torture myself, but to see the pattern clearly, because patterns predict the next hit. First they dismissed it, then they claimed it should be shared, then they filed in court, then they attacked my character, then they tried to recruit a clinic, then a law office, then they tried a doorstep ambush with paperwork, and that means the next move wouldn't be emotional, it would be institutional, a wellness check, a fraud report, a call to my landlord, something that sounds responsible. And right as I was thinking that, my phone lit up with an unknown number, and when I didn't answer, it went to voicemail, and a calm woman's voice said, "Hello, this is Adult Protective Services. We received a report, and we need to speak with Maya Pierce regarding concerns about her well-being and decision-making. Please call us back as soon as possible." And my blood went cold, because my mother's little warning wasn't a warning, it was a schedule, and now the system was at my door, without even knocking yet. I stared at that voicemail like it was a live grenade sitting on my desk, because Adult Protective Services is one of those phrases that sounds like safety until it's used like a crowbar, and I knew exactly how this was going to be framed, not my parents are trying to steal my business, but we're worried about her. And the scary part is how easily that concern becomes a file, and then a file becomes a narrative, and then the narrative becomes permission for strangers to enter your life with clipboards and questions. I didn't panic, I didn't delete it, I didn't call back in a rush like a guilty person trying to prove innocence. I did what you do when you understand systems. I built my paper trail first. I forwarded the voicemail audio to my attorney and labeled it with the date and time. And then I sent a short email to myself with the exact transcript of what the woman said, because if this ever landed in court, I wanted to show consistency. Not "I think she said," but "here's what she said." And then I called Callahan, and he answered like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Let me guess," he said, "APS," and I felt this tight, bitter laugh press up in my throat, because when your lawyer can guess your next crisis before you say it, that tells you how common this play is. And he said, "Okay, listen carefully." And he broke it down in a way that made my pulse slow. APS can't just force their way in unless there's an emergency or a court order. They can request a visit. They can ask questions. You can choose how to respond. The goal is to cooperate without surrendering your rights. And I asked him the question every decent person asks the first time they hear APS. "But if I don't cooperate, won't that make me look guilty?" And he said, "Not if we do it correctly. We respond in writing. We offer a scheduled call with you and counsel present, and we provide neutral proof of capacity. We do not let them show up unannounced and interview you like you're a suspect in your own life." And that word, suspect, hit me hard, because that's exactly what my parents were trying to manufacture. A situation where my calm boundaries look like paranoia and their manipulation looks like love. I opened my laptop and started drafting the response the way Callahan taught me. Short, polite, factual, no emotion, no insults, no family gossip, just structure. "Hello, I received your voicemail. I am safe and capable. I understand you received a report. Because this appears connected to an ongoing civil dispute and harassment, I request all communication be in writing, and I am available for a scheduled phone interview with my attorney present." And before I hit send, Callahan said, "Add one more line." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Ask for the allegation in general terms, because you can't respond to smoke. You respond to claims," so I added, "Please provide the general nature of the concerns so I can respond accurately." And when I sent it, I felt something important shift, because the difference between being controlled and being respected is often one sentence written calmly. The next morning, my first class started at 7 a.m., and I made myself do it anyway, because if you're watching this and you've ever lived under a controlling family, you know the trap. They want you to stop functioning. They want you to miss work, miss appointments, miss meals, look messy, sound frantic, and then they point and say, "See." So I taught the class like my life depended on it, because it did, and the whole time I was cueing breath and posture. Part of my mind was running a second script. What if APS shows up while I'm mid-session? What if my parents send a wellness check? What if they call the landlord? What if they message my students? And I hated that. I hated that my mind couldn't rest in a room that was built for peace. But that's what betrayal does. It takes a safe place and turns it into a battlefield. After class, Mrs. Ellison came up and said, "Honey, you look tired." And I wanted to tell her everything, but I didn't, because this isn't a small town where gossip stays friendly. It spreads, and my brother would weaponize it. So I just smiled and said, "Long week," and she squeezed my hand like she didn't buy it. And then my phone buzzed again, a reply from APS, short and official. "We have received a report alleging financial exploitation and impaired judgment. We request an in-person visit within 48 hours. And there it was, the script, financial exploitation. The phrase designed to make you sound like you're either being scammed or doing the scamming, and impaired judgment. The vague, foggy phrase that invites assumptions, and I could practically hear my mother saying it into the phone. Careful, tearful. She's not herself. She's making bad decisions. We're worried. And I could hear my brother adding his special spice. She's isolated. She's overworked. She won't listen. And I stood there in the studio hallway with that message on my screen, and I made a choice that felt like swallowing glass. I was going to cooperate, but I was going to do it on my terms, with witnesses, with documentation, with my attorney, and I wasn't going to let them turn my silence into their evidence. Callahan set the plan in motion quickly. He contacted APS on my behalf, confirmed I'd participate in a scheduled call first, and offered a neutral packet, my lease, business registration, tax filings, bank verification that no unusual withdrawals occurred, and a fresh capacity letter from my doctor stating I'm competent to manage personal and financial affairs, and that letter should not have to exist. But in the real world, when someone tries to paint you as incapable, a simple professional statement can stop a whole machine from rolling over you. Now listen, this is where I want to pull you into the story, like you're sitting at my kitchen table with me, because I need your opinion and I want a comment section to be honest. Do you think it's ever acceptable to call authorities on your own child or sibling over money? And I mean really, not they're in danger, but I want control, because that's what this is, and I'm asking you to type it plainly in the comments. Did my parents cross the line, or did I owe them because we share blood? And while you're at it, tell me where you stand on this. Do you believe family loyalty means silence, or do you believe loyalty ends the second someone tries to erase you? And right here, quick favor, because I'm seeing the same thing on our analytics every week. More viewers are watching than joining the community. So if you've ever dealt with a controlling family, a greedy sibling, a situation where someone used concern as a weapon, subscribe and join us. Thank you. It helps keep these stories coming, and it helps other people feel less alone when they're living through it. Anyway, the scheduled call was set for the next day at 3 p.m., and I prepared like it was a job interview with my freedom on the line, because I printed my documents, I organized them in a binder, and I wrote down my timeline in bullet points. The moment my brother first demanded shared ownership, the filing date of the petition, the coercive text messages, the doorstep visit, the police incident number. And I kept it boring on purpose, because boring is credible. Drama is what they want from you. 2:58 p.m., Callahan was on speaker with me, and at 3:01 p.m., the APS caseworker joined. Her voice sounded normal, not cruel, not friendly, just procedural. "Ms. Pierce, my name is Angela Ruiz. I'm calling regarding a report we received." And Callahan immediately stated his name and role, and that changed the temperature. You could hear it. Systems behave differently when they realize you have counsel, and Ms. Ruiz said, "We received allegations that you're being financially exploited through your business, and that your decision-making may be impaired due to stress or mental health concerns." And the way she said it, like she was reading from a script, told me she'd heard a version of this before, and I answered with the three things you always answer with when you're being framed. I am safe, I am capable, and there is an ongoing civil dispute in which the reporting parties have attempted to obtain control of assets I own. And Callahan added, "We have documentation supporting that." And then Ms. Ruiz asked the question that made my skin prickle. "Are you willing to allow an in-person visit so we can ensure your safety?" And I said, "Yes, scheduled, with my attorney present, and I prefer it at my place of business during operating hours, because I refuse to let them show up at my apartment and turn my private life into a spectacle." She agreed, and we scheduled it for the following morning at 10 a.m., and when we ended the call, I felt a weird mix of relief and disgust. Relief because I'd met the system with structure. Disgust because my parents had forced me into proving my own competence like it was a contest. The next day, I cleaned the studio like a stage set, not because I'm ashamed of mess, but because mess gives people imagination, and people with imagination can be dangerous when they're writing reports. I set out a chair for Ms. Ruiz, a chair for Callahan, and I put my binder on the table like a quiet warning. I came prepared. And at 10:07 a.m., she arrived. Alone, no police. No drama, just a woman with a badge and a folder, and she looked around the studio, the clean mats, the schedule board, the sign-in sheets, the tidy desk, and you could see her brain recalibrate, because this did not look like a person who can't manage reality. She asked me basic questions. Do you have access to food, medication, transportation? And I answered plainly, and then she asked, do you feel pressured by anyone to sign documents or transfer ownership of property? And I said, yes. And I slid the doorstep video forward, and I slid the text message screenshots forward, and I slid the police incident card forward, and she read them without reacting, but her eyes got tighter in that way people do when the story shifts from concern to control. And then she asked me, who made the report? And Callahan said, we request that in writing, and she nodded and she said, I can't always disclose. And then she added, almost reluctantly, but I can note that the report came from a family member with a stated financial interest. And there it was, the quiet confession. They flagged themselves, and she looked up at me and said, Miss Pierce, I'm going to be direct. And my stomach clenched, and she said, from what I'm seeing, you're not the vulnerable party here. You're the target. And I swear to you, I felt tears threaten for the first time in weeks. Not because I was weak, but because someone neutral finally said the truth out loud. Then she said the sentence that made my pulse spike again. However, there is another issue. And she opened her folder and looked at a line and said, we received an additional call this morning stating you are planning to harm yourself if you lose the case. And my whole body went cold, because that wasn't just manipulation. That was the kind of accusation that can get you detained, hospitalized, labeled, and stripped of rights in a single afternoon. And I looked at Callahan and he looked at me and he didn't flinch. He just said, we need the call recording and the reporting number immediately. And Ms. Ruiz hesitated. And then she said quietly, I don't have the recording. But the call came in through a local crisis line that forwarded it to us. And Callahan asked, did they provide a name? And she paused and said, they said they were your mother. And I felt my stomach drop through the floor because my mother had just escalated from help to suicide claim. And that is the dirtiest move in this entire playbook because it weaponizes compassion and it forces authorities to treat you like a threat to yourself. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. If my parents were willing to say that, what else were they willing to say to win? And Ms. Ruiz closed her folder slowly and said, I'm required to do a safety assessment today. And Callahan nodded once, calm. Do it, he said, and we will document that the allegation is false and retaliatory. And Ms. Ruiz turned to me and asked, do you have any thoughts of harming yourself? And I looked her straight in the eye and said, no. I have plans for tomorrow's classes and next month's workshop schedule, and I have a court hearing where I intend to defend myself, not disappear. And she watched me for a beat, and then she said, okay. And she wrote something down, and then she stood and said, I'll be in touch. And as she walked out, she turned back once and said, for your own safety, you may want to consider a restraining order. And when the door closed behind her, I didn't collapse, I didn't scream, I didn't call my mother and beg her to stop. I did the only thing that actually works against people like this. I opened my phone, hit record, and I spoke a statement into it with the date and time. Today, APS informed me that my mother reported I was suicidal if I lost my case. This is false. I deny self-harm intent. This appears retaliatory and connected to the ongoing property dispute. And then I sent it to Callahan, and he replied with 2 words that made my blood run cold in a different way. Emergency motion. Because now this wasn't just a family fight. It was a legal emergency, and the next step wasn't a courtroom speech. It was a judge deciding whether my mother's lie would trigger a hold. And as I sat there in my quiet studio, with the mirror lights humming and the mats lined up like nothing happened, my phone lit up with a text from an unknown number that read, "If you don't sign by tonight, we'll make sure you don't teach another class again." And I knew, in my bones, the next 24 hours would decide whether I kept my business or lost my freedom. The text from that unknown number sat on my screen like a fingerprint because it wasn't just a threat, it was proof of intent. And people like my parents always forget that intimidation leaves evidence when you're too arrogant to be subtle. So I didn't reply, I didn't negotiate, and I didn't do the thing they wanted most, which was spiral into fear and start making sloppy moves. I screenshot it, I backed it up to email, and then I forwarded it to Callahan with a simple subject line that sounded boring on purpose. Threat received after APS visit, and within 2 minutes he called and said, "Good, we're going to use this." And it felt strange hearing a lawyer sound almost relieved, but I understood why, because courts can ignore feelings all day, but they don't ignore timestamps, written threats, and patterns of interference. Callahan told me to go home, lock my doors, and do one thing before I slept. Write a clean timeline with exact dates and the 3 weapons my family used: civil petition, false welfare reporting, and coercive threats. And then he said, "Tomorrow morning, we're filing an emergency motion to prevent harassment and to notify the court of attempted witness intimidation." And that phrase, witness intimidation, landed differently than family drama because it put their behavior where it belonged, in the category of consequences. I didn't sleep much. Not because I was scared of what they might do physically, but because I was sickened by how far they were willing to go to win a building and a truck. And the next morning I walked into my studio early before sunrise, and I did what I always do when life tries to break me. I cleaned and I organized and I made the space calm, because if my world was going to shake, I wanted at least one room that didn't. And then at 8:12 a.m. Callahan texted, "Motion filed. Judge granted same-day hearing 2 p.m. Be available." And that part made my stomach drop, because when a judge moves fast, it means the situation is serious enough to need control, and I knew exactly why. My mother's suicidal claim could trigger a chain reaction with professionals who don't know me, and once that chain starts, you don't get to pause it to explain your personality. So the goal became simple: get in front of the judge before someone else writes my story for me. At 10:03 a.m., APS emailed, and their tone had changed. From neutral to formal. "Due to additional report of self-harm risk, we recommend immediate evaluation." And that sentence is how people lose their autonomy, because recommend can become required the minute someone says you refused. So Callahan responded immediately, and he did it in a way that cornered the truth without sounding combative. "My client denies self-harm intent. This allegation appears retaliatory. We request the reporting call metadata and documentation. We will address this in court today." And then he told me something that felt unfair, but smart. "We're going to preempt this by offering a voluntary mental health check with your chosen provider, not an emergency hold. And we're going to do it on record, because the difference between voluntary and forced is often whether you show up first." At noon, I went to my primary care office, not because I needed validation, but because the system respects letters from people with licenses. And my doctor looked at me for about 30 seconds before she said, "Let me guess, someone is trying to weaponize a diagnosis." And I nodded. And she asked clear questions: sleep, appetite, self-harm thoughts, daily functioning, work schedule, and I answered honestly. I'm stressed, I'm angry, I'm functioning, I'm safe. And she wrote a brief letter. Patient-oriented, coherent, denies suicidal ideation, no evidence of acute risk, capable of self-management. And that letter was infuriating to need, but it was powerful to have. By 1:40 p.m., I was outside the courthouse with Callahan, and he didn't give me a pep talk. He gave me a checklist. No speeches. No sarcasm. We stick to facts. We show the judge a pattern. We ask for an order that stops them from contacting your clients, interfering with your business, or making false reports. And then he paused and said, and we ask the court to consider sanctions on the plaintiff for using state resources as leverage. And I asked, will the judge actually do that? And he said, if the judge sees this as abusive process, yes. And abusive process is the cleanest phrase for what my family was doing, turning institutions into weapons, then hiding behind the word concern, as if concern should excuse sabotage. When we walked into the courtroom, my brother was already there with my parents, and the image was almost funny if it wasn't disgusting. The three of them sitting like a united front, dressed like they were attending a church function, my mother clutching tissues she didn't need yet, my father leaning back with that calm face he uses when he thinks he's the authority in every room, and my brother doing his favorite thing, looking concerned. While enjoying the chaos, he started, and when he saw me, he gave that little half smile that says, you're still here, how annoying. And I swear I could feel the old version of me, the quiet kid who swallowed blame, trying to resurface, but it couldn't, because I had grown into a woman who learned that silence is a tool, not a cage. The judge came in, and it wasn't Judge Ramirez in this version of our story. It was Judge Hollowell, older, precise, and the type who doesn't like being manipulated, and he opened by saying, we are here on an emergency motion filed by the defense concerning alleged harassment and interference, and my brother's attorney immediately tried to paint me as dramatic. Your Honor, the plaintiff's family is simply concerned about her mental health, and the judge didn't even look impressed. He said, counsel, concern is not a legal license to disrupt. And then Callahan stood and laid it out like a map. Not emotional, not messy, just chronological. Proof. The coercive texts, the lawsuit demanding ownership after profit, the threat about making sure I don't teach again, the APS report alleging financial exploitation and impaired judgment, then the second report alleging suicidal intent, then the timing, always after I refused to sign anything, always after a court setback. Always when my brother needed leverage, and then Callahan did the most important thing. He made it visual. He handed the judge a single-page timeline with exhibits, labeled a through H, because judges love clarity more than they love tears. Then the judge asked the one question that made the room turn cold. Who made the APS report? And my brother's attorney tried to dodge. Your Honor, we cannot confirm. And the judge cut him off. I'm not asking for a rumor. I'm asking if your client or your client's family initiated contact with APS related to this dispute. And my mother did what manipulative people always do when cornered. She started crying softly, and she said, we were afraid. And the judge looked at her like she was a grown adult who should understand the difference between fear and fraud. And he asked, afraid of what? And my father answered, afraid she'll ruin the business. And Callahan said quietly, the business she built alone. And the judge's eyes narrowed, because that is the whole thing in one sentence. They weren't afraid for me. They were afraid of losing access to what I created. Then Callahan played the voicemail, the one where APS said financial exploitation and impaired judgment. And the judge listened, and you could feel the shift in the courtroom, because suddenly this wasn't a family dispute. It was a record of attempted institutional pressure. And when Callahan finished, he said, Your Honor, we also submit a medical letter confirming no self-harm risk, And we ask the court to caution the plaintiff and his witnesses that further false reporting may constitute harassment and abusive process. And my brother's attorney objected. That's speculative. And Callahan didn't even blink. The pattern is documented, he said, and the judge turned to my brother and asked him directly, Mr. Mercer, did you not send messages demanding your sister transfer ownership? And my brother tried the sweet voice. I was trying to help. And the judge said, help usually doesn't include threats. And then the judge asked, did you not send a message stating sign by tonight or you won't teach another class again? And my brother's face tightened and he said, I didn't mean it like that. And the judge's tone went flat. Meaning is irrelevant. The message is written. And then the judge did what judges do when they're done with games. He issued an order from the bench. No contact with my clients or students, no contact with my landlord, no contact with vendors, no false reports to agencies. All communication must go through counsel. Any violation triggers sanctions and potential referral. And he added one more thing that felt like oxygen. The court notes the apparent use of outside agencies to gain leverage in a civil property dispute. And he stared at my brother like a warning. This court will not tolerate it. And in that moment, my parents' faces changed, not because they suddenly felt guilty, but because they realized the authority in the room was no longer theirs to steer. Outside the courthouse, my mother tried to approach me with that soft voice. We need to talk. And I finally spoke to her the way a person speaks when they've stopped begging to be loved. You don't need to talk to me, I said. You needed to stop. And my father snapped, you're tearing this family apart. And I looked at him and said, no, you're just finally not in control. And I walked away with Callahan, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear, because clarity is what you get when you stop trying to win love from people who only respect power. That night, I went back to the studio, turned on the mirror lights, and sat in the center of the floor like I did after the hearing, and I listened to the building settle, and I realized the real victory wasn't the judge's order. It was the moment I stopped letting my family define my sanity. And I need you to hear this part if you've lived anything like this. When people call you unstable for having boundaries, what they really mean is you're no longer convenient. And the second you stop being convenient, they start calling your strength a symptom. I checked my phone one last time before I locked up, and there was a notification from the court docket. The judge had scheduled a status conference for the main case sooner than expected, and attached was a note. Plaintiff to show cause regarding conduct. And that sentence told me the next hearing wasn't going to be about my supposed fragility. It was going to be about their behavior under oath. And as I turned off the lights and felt the quiet wrap around me like a blanket, I knew the next chapter wasn't me defending what I built. It was them explaining why they thought they could take it and call it love. And if you think that's where the story ends, you're wrong, because the very next morning, someone left a sealed envelope taped to my studio door. No return address. Just my name in block letters, and inside was one photograph and one handwritten sentence that made my hands go cold all over again. If you want the full truth about Grandpa's will, meet us alone.